Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this very important program on resisting impunity. My name is Mandatum Lodwa, and I am your co-host for today's show. We're coming to you on the 4th month anniversary of a week that sent shockwaves across Africa and the world, when 3 high-profile human rights defenders were murdered on consecutive days: Thulani Maseko in eSwatini, John Williams Ntwali in Rwanda, and Martinez Zogo in Cameroon. 120 days later, many questions still remain. Accountability and real justice remain evasive, and impunity has largely prevailed. During today's show, we will discuss the issue of impunity and how every unchallenged assassination can further embolden the use of violence and murder, putting more vulnerable human rights defenders at risk in Africa and elsewhere across the globe. Helping me guide our discussion today is my colleague, Jeffrey Smith. Hey, Jeff, how are you feeling today?
Doing really well. And, obviously today is going to be a difficult show, but I'm really glad we're doing it and glad to be doing it with you and our amazing speakers that we have here with us today.
Thank you so much, Jeff. As a way of refreshing everyone's memory, the Resistance Bureau focuses on major threats on human rights and freedom in Africa and worldwide, while shining a light on the enduring struggles for freedom. This show features leaders who are reshaping African politics and the way the world views the continent. It is in the spirit that we're joined today by today's panel. First, we have Thulani Maseko, the widow of Thulani Maseko, the widely celebrated activist that I mentioned in today's intro, who was murdered in his home on the 21st of January 2023 by suspected state agents. Thulani has bravely carried on his legacy to advocate for human rights, justice, and accountability. Recently, she was named the vice chairperson of the Southern Africa Human Rights Defenders Network. We are also joined by Peter Biya Ajak, who currently lives in exile after he was personally targeted for kidnapping by South Sudanese security services. Peter is a brave activist and a former political prisoner who serves as the coordinator for Africa at the World Liberty Congress, an NGO that builds solidarity among activists working in authoritarian countries. We also have Mimi Mefo, who's not a stranger to targeted attacks. As a result of her investigative journalism in Cameroon, she has spent time in jail. She has faced death threats as well as harassment and near constant surveillance. In 2018, she established the news platform Mimi Mefo Info, an independent source of information in the country. Our discussant today will speak with us after our panel is Arnold Tunga, who was a close friend and colleague of Thulani Maseko. He's an accomplished lawyer from Zimbabwe, human rights defender, and for a time was an elected member of parliament. He has held numerous leadership positions, including as director of the Africa Regional Program at the International Commission of Jurists. For our listeners today, be sure to follow us on Twitter @ResistBureau and use the hashtag ResistBureau Live for today's show. Right now, we're live streaming on Facebook and YouTube, as well as recording the show for later distribution. Before we turn to today's panel, I will hand it over to you, Jeff, so that you can set the scene for today's discussion. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mantadi, and for everyone joining us today. As mentioned in our intro, over the course of 3 days in January, a trio of the continent's most intrepid and well-respected leaders had been silenced. The brazen killings of Thulani Maseko and eSwatini, who was a close personal friend of mine, as well as John Williams Ntwali in Rwanda and Martinez Zogo in Cameroon, really shocked us all. More recently, last week, in fact, Rally Canelo Joki was gunned down after finishing his radio show in Lesotho. He had received numerous death threats over the years, but received no protection, and the many warnings fell on deaf ears. Initially, all of these assassinations, of course, led to denunciations from democratic governments across the world. As many feared, however, as many of us feared, this outpouring of concern and the calls for accountability quickly subsided. As Kananelo Boletse, chair of the Lesotho branch of the Media Institute of Southern Africa, recently put it, one reason Joki was killed was that no one had yet been held accountable for the previous attacks on journalists in Lesotho and elsewhere. Impunity, of course, breeds more impunity, including across borders. There were 185 assassinations in Africa between 2019 and 2020, in a wide range of countries, including Kenya, Mozambique, Nigeria, Somalia, and South Africa, in dictatorships and democracies alike. Almost 80% of these were found to be politically motivated. As impunity prevails, the more vulnerable journalists, human rights defenders, and even opposition political figures become. With deafening silence from African leaders and democratic powers outside the continent sitting on their hands, these deaths have certainly not been the last. In today's show, we will ask what can be done to challenge impunity and hold authoritarian leaders, their hit squads, and armed enforcers accountable for their actions. Our team here at the Resistance Bureau are deeply concerned about this because we so often encourage human rights defenders to speak out, to literally put their lives on the line to expose corruption, and to demand and defend their basic democratic rights. Yet just as often, leaders with influence in the region and global powers fail to have their backs when they are inevitably pressed against the wall by their abusers in power. This show has therefore convened survivors and advocates to discuss these critical issues. We hope that this show serves as both a fitting tribute to those we have lost and their impact, as well as to provide hope to those who have bravely picked up the baton, including those like Thulani Maseko with us today. In addition to our speakers, we also depend on you, our audience, to share your thoughts through our YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook comment sections. You can also send us your questions directly via WhatsApp on the number available on the screen right now. Ntwali, back over to you to bring in today's speakers.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that scenario mapping. Mr. Tsunga, I will start with you. Many of our viewers today may not know what happened in Thulani Maseko's home in January 21 of this year, or the events that were leading up to it, including public threats made by King Mswati himself, the monarch who has ruled the country for a generation. While we know this is incredibly painful for you as someone who was very close to Thulani, both as a friend and work colleague, we wanted to ask you if you can explain to our viewers what really happened and why we're here today.
Thank you, Mantati and Jeffrey. And I just want to, to congratulate you for, I think, commemorating colleagues, human rights defenders who have really put their life on the block to try and defend the rights of others and to improve the social, economic, political conditions of many, especially on the African continent. I think it's a fitting tribute. And then just to talk about Thulani, yes, it's true that Thulani and I worked together for the longest of time, really. Firstly, we were working in different organizations. I was the director for Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, which is a law-based organization pushing back on repression and weaponization of the law in Zimbabwe. And then he was the director of Lawyers for Human Rights. And in eSwatini. And so as a result, we collaborated and shared a lot of notes in terms of how to push back on authoritarian practices. And then later on, we then worked together in the same organization, the International Commission of Jurists, trying to strengthen the rule of law in Africa and working with judiciaries and legal profession essentially to try and improve on access to justice and strengthening of separation of powers and the rule of law in Africa. And it is during that time that he was very open about his desire for the people of eSwatini to reflect on whether the system of government was working for them or not, in particular the absolute monarch, which is, I think, the only absolute monarch that is left in the world, where he felt that Swazi people were treated as subjects and not as citizens, and therefore their civic participation in the socio-economic affairs of their country needed to be improved. And that put him on a collision course with the monarch because of the fact that he felt that the monarch was treating Swaziland as private property, essentially. And therefore, there was no voice on the part of the people, and he was being seen as a very strong threat to the monarch itself. So if you then fast forward to say what happened to him, maybe quickly I'll say between 2013 and 2015, he spent 2 years in jail for being convicted of contempt of court when he had written a very strong opinion expressing dismay at the way the Chief Justice and the judiciary had imprisoned without a proper trial an ordinary citizen who was basically arrested doing his job. And so once he wrote that opinion, he was then charged with contempt of court, which in ordinary circumstances should really carry, if convicted, a maximum of 3 months in prison. And that's where I first met Jeff, when Jeffrey flew all the way to Babane to try and give solidarity to Thulani during the trial. And then we developed this bond with Jeffrey in terms of looking at the democracy situation in Swaziland. But once he was put in jail and ultimately his imprisonment was declared to be unlawful, that did not break him, because that was the idea, to break him and to prevent him from pushing for democracy and dialogue on democracy in Swaziland. And then because of the fact that they didn't break him, it is very unfortunate that in June 2001, when the university students went into a protest, one student was killed, and then that resulted in a huge civil uprising, which then persisted for a year. And Thulani remained a very strong proponent that we need a dialogue so that the king and the people of Swaziland could discuss the type of government and the governance system that they needed. And because of that, they then targeted him. And sadly, on the 21st of January, he was killed in cold blood in front of his wife and 2 children. And that was around 11 p.m. at night. And how we got to know about it is because I got a call from someone in Swaziland who said, Daniel is asking for you to call because something is happening at your house. A shooting incident has just happened and Thulani is injured. So when I called Sanele, she confirmed that Thulani had been shot. And I said, okay, maybe we should try to see if we can get a medical air rescue for him. She said, don't waste your time because I can see his brain on the floor and a piece of his skull. I'm sorry to say this, but that's the truth. And that's the experience that Daniel and the children experienced when a man shot Thulani using a high velocity weapon from within 2 meters whilst he was seated watching television in what we thought would be the safest place for him, his own home in a lounge towards the middle of the night, totally unprovoked. Totally shocking that the authorities could proceed that way in Swaziland. So I think the human rights community in Southern Africa were very good because they immediately gave outpourings of sympathy and then gave Thulani a very decent farewell. We had virtually the who is who in Southern Africa as human rights defenders attending the funeral in defiance and being able to speak very strongly that a man who was asking for nothing but dialogue to resolve a governance crisis met the most violent of deaths purely for being a peace ambassador. So that's what I can say happened, and it's something that is very sad. Feelings of anger, hopelessness, helplessness, because as Jeffrey said earlier on, there hasn't been any effective investigation. All the hallmarks of impunity and are there, and therefore the impact on the larger community of pro-democracy activists and human rights defenders is huge because people are afraid. There's drone surveillance everywhere, and it's very clear because when he was killed, it is exactly on the same day that the king had said, people are going to die and I don't want to hear anyone complaining. Over to you, Mantate.
Thank you very much, Arnold, for that comprehensive outline and for sharing your personal thoughts. I think it's important to reiterate the fact that, while we all collectively and individually work within activism, and it's in a very real sense our day job, it's not a business for us. Right. It's profoundly personal, and it's based on profoundly personal relationships with those brave activists on the ground, like Thulani. So thank you very much for sharing your insights. And I definitely share them. He was an inspiration to me and to many of us. But right now I'd like to bring in Peter, who also knew Thulani quite well. And Peter, we heard Arnold talking about how the human rights community has really coalesced and come together in the aftermath of Thulani's assassination, calling for an independent investigation, calling for the involvement of regional institutions and global powers to impose consequences on the perpetrators. But so often in my conversations with activists and in many conversations I have, many of them, still feel as if they're going through these ordeals alone, right? That their situations are unique. So I wanted to ask you, because I know you're involved in the World Liberty Congress and a number of other international organizations, to ask you, what is being done to better connect activists, to build support and learn from each other, as well as to build the necessary alliances globally, within Africa and internationally, to demand accountability and justice for victims?
Well, first of all, let me say to Thulani and to people of eSwatini or Swaziland, my sincerest condolences. Every time when I think about the loss of Thulani Maseko, I just can't bear it. I can't imagine the impact that it must have had on his immediate family, especially with the tragic way in which it happened, being shot in the front of his family, being shot in the head, as Arnold was speaking. Absolutely tragic for the family, for the kids. Just unbelievable level of cruelty. Even if people have fundamental differences, it's really hard to imagine someone who poses no immediate physical threat being met with that level of violence. So I have to say condolences to the family and to the people of Swaziland, because losing someone like Thulani Maseko is tragic for the country, because when you look at countries like Swaziland or South Sudan, these are countries where institutions are extremely weak, where individuals like Thulani could make a massive difference in the society through the network that he brings and the resources that this network would attract. If someone like Thulani had been empowered and work within the country, I know very well his network, the power of his network, and the ability to use that positively is really shocking, the way in which Africa continues to behave. Because people like Thulani, instead, every time when they are running around the world, going there to talk about the need for freedom in their country, basic things that we should have known by now, that are rights of our people, things that they should be given, things that they are entitled to, things that were given to them by God, that instead of those being the issues that we move around the countries in halls of power complaining, we could be talking about the need to attract investments into our country, to deal with issues of climate change, issues of empowerment of our people, building infrastructure, and building a 21st century economy in our continent, and uplifting the African people and people of African diaspora. So it's really tragic that these are the conversations that we continue to have. And the fundamental real issues that our people are subjected to, issues of poverty, ignorance, and disease, do not even find time to be discussed, because we are talking about our lives and our very basic liberties. So absolutely tragic. I know the loss and what it means, and it's devastating, because it's not easy to produce someone like Thulani. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of investment from different parts of the world to have someone like that. And for someone like that to be cut down by his own state, his own government, instead of being utilized to empower the country that desperately need people like Thulani, is absolutely tragic. So let me say there. On the question that you asked, and I think this must be, it would be interesting to hear from the perspective of Danele, but I can tell you from my personal experience that yes, indeed, you find a lot of people that are ready to speak out when terrible things happen, right? When Thulani was killed, when all these murders happened, there was a universal condemnation, and people will speak up, people will tweet, and it will go on, make rounds for like days. Maybe if you're lucky, you can get something to trend. But after that, then what? It doesn't really translate into any real kind of meaningful change in policy. Because what is really tragic about the human rights community, it has really been reduced to basically speaking up, talking, shedding lights on things, and relying on governments of the West to be the one that will actually achieve that accountability. Governments like the United States, many in Europe. Now, the problem is those governments, they are run by people that have all kinds of philosophical worldviews. Yes, there are people that maybe want to implement a policy that is grounded in values, but most of the time you find people that are just committed to doing whatever that they found there to have been done in the past. So you just have like recycling of the same all ideas. And those all ideas were built on this false notion of stability, that the devil you know is better than the angel that you don't know. And you find recently with the emergence of China and the resurgence of Russia, that real politics has become the real determining factor in how policy is determined. So you find Biden administration talking about democracy, accountability, human rights, but then things like this happen. Now, you know very well from the experience that we know of eSwatini, that Thulani murder was not the first. Thulani was in a case with a number of individuals, many of whom have been killed. And they have been killed one by one. I think the only remaining survivor in this case is Maxwell Dlamini, who had to be evacuated out of the country just a few days after Thulani was murdered. So this has been done consistently. And you, Jeff, you were with me in December when Biden hosted the US-Africa Leaders Summit. And we, the activists, we were pushed to a building at the US Institute of Peace, which was really a joke, because what was happening there was just like a check mark. You had these sessions that were pre-arranged. No one could ask any question. You know, it was all scripted just to say that there had been input by activists and human rights defenders. And talking about issues, yes, they are very important issues, but they are not the real pressing issues. The real pressing political issues that are determining what is happening in the continent and what will determine the future of the continent were entirely ignored. And you couldn't really tell a difference between a US-Africa summit and a US-China summit. No matter how much Americans want to criticize Chinese, at least the Chinese are honest about their worldview. They don't give a squat about what activists think. But here in the West, there is this feeling that they care about these issues. But when really push come to shove, what do? Nothing. And if you find like actually things that when it comes to like the support that you need, is one thing when you have been cut down like Thulani. But when you are in the trenches, when you are struggling to bring about that freedom, and you come around to people to ask for support, you are treated with all these kind of skepticism. It's as if they do not even believe in their own aspirations of freedom and aspirations of democracy. It's like there is this cynicism that has become the real thing that people here in Washington understand. And even you find people wondering, why are we taking this risk? Why are you risking? Like, I spent 2 years in jail. Why did I subject my family to that? Someone like Thulani, he's now killed. His wife is widowed. His children are orphaned. Why? And then they will tell you things like, there is a difference between what is mine and then what is ours. And the nation is ours, is not mine. And then when you take it as is yours, you become a victim. And then what? You know. And when you hear those stories, what is the end point of them? Is despair. Is despair to basically say there is no hope and we should not try. And who are we to even challenge these authoritarian powers? So what is happening with this so-called global activism democracy group is just like people going to a bunch of conferences. Next week, people are in Copenhagen, and then the next week they're in Oslo, they're in Johannesburg, but in real building movements on the ground and actually making sure that things are being done, and leaders that are behaving in the ways that King Mswati has behaved, and in which many African leaders have behaved. Even in the case of South Sudan, I was not the first person that was targeted. Dong Samuel, who was a lawyer, was targeted in Nairobi with Agri Idris. They were kidnapped, brought to South Sudan, to the same prison where I was detained, and executed. The US State Department wrote a report in which is detailed who exactly was responsible. And they, up to now, have been unable to sanction the Director General of South Sudan National Security Service. And their own report details that he was the one that facilitated the kidnap of these individuals who were registered as refugees in Kenya, you know, in violation of every norms, every international law. Nothing has been done. So it's difficult to then say, you know, you are not alone. You are not alone. You are alone. You are alone in your own country with those people. And I think this has been the problem. So what we want to change now is for us to really come together as activists people who are actually in the trenches and see how do we help one another? How do we empower our own voices and not think that we have this community that we are relying on who are not even really there to help us. So it's difficult, yes, to not feel that this is something you are doing alone. Imagine now with Tanela, I would love to hear from her. But since Thulani has died, what has been done to help her and the children that now Thulani has left behind, you know? And when that happened, how can the next activist not be afraid to speak up? Because you see the evidence of what the cause is, what it means, what the future might mean. But I think the most important thing is this. What drives many of us is not because we believe we are invincible. We are human beings, we have flesh and blood, we can be killed. We don't have any supernatural powers. But we want to tell our people that there is no any other way that this thing will end. It will only end with us speaking up and demanding and exercising our freedom. And every nation and every act, there is a good that come out of it. Even in sacrifice, even in martyrdom, nations are not built by heroes alone. Martyrs also inspire future generations. So people may look at the sacrifice that someone like Thulani has made, but these are only foolish people that do not understand history and how we came to be where we are today. It didn't come cheaply. Freedom it was not offered. If you look at the entire history of mankind, you know, freedom has not always been the norm. It has been the exceptional. And it's because people like Thulani has been willing to pay the ultimate sacrifices, right? And it's because of that, that such a thing exists. And it is incumbent upon all of us that benefit from freedom to protect it in real meaning, not just to speak of it, but to actually do things that will advance it and will protect those who are fighting for it.
Thank you so much, Peter. You've said so much. I would love to just follow up on everything, but I think a lot of it is still going to come up in the conversation that we're still going to have with all of the other panelists. And like you already mentioned, that you'd love to hear from Thulani Maseko. Like, part of the conversation we're trying to have today is about that continuity of solidarity and support, to say what happens to families when we've lost a defender, what happens to their children, but not just that, but looking at every other human rights defender, ordinary people that see that these people who are their heroes and they almost feel discouraged and feel like, why am I risking it? Like you were asking. So that's definitely going to be a part of this conversation. The other thing that you mentioned that was very important for me was just the idea that fundamental differences will exist. And that's just the nature of, you know, the universe, the world we're in, but how we react to those differences is where it's at. And we're here today because of a failure to deal with our differences in ways that are respectful, because ultimately our differences are conversations around access to human rights. Why are we disagreeing on the basic fact that human beings need to be able to access basic human rights? We need to have these fundamental democratic freedoms. Why do we not have that source of convergence around that issue? But I wanted to also ask you a question, because you're one of the people that has been forced to live outside your home country because of the direct threats to your life. How does that separation from your family and the familiar environment impact on you personally and your work as an activist? How can others who are also living in exile have impact on the ground, even if they're far from home?
Well, you have to stay connected with your network. The struggle does not end because you have been forced into exile. And I think this is usually the intention of these regimes, is to make sure that you are not able to mobilize the network that you are mobilizing, that you are not able to empower the people. Because what they fear is people of the country being united in demanding a particular idea, right? Because that's really when a state comes to exist, right? Most of the problem in Africa is we have countries, but we do not really have states, because a state is a consensus, is a pursuit of a certain political idea. And because most of the time we have never really had the space to discuss and build consensus on that ideas, is always being debated and being contested. And I think that the challenge that we have is really to build that consensus, but that requires political space. It requires environment that tolerate, provide tolerance. Now, the problem that we then find ourselves is, in many of our countries, this is not provided on the ground. You know, because if you try to do on the ground, they fear that the people are coming together. And if the people come together, they will not be able to hold on to power, which they use basically to loot and to get themselves rich. So they are threatened by that, and they respond with this kind of tactics, either to kill you or to force you into exile. Now, when you go to exile, like in my case, the idea is then to disconnect you from your networks and try to put pressure on those that are still connected to you on the ground. So it's very important to then find ways to continue to operate. And this is where like finances become very important. And it's one of the things that you find lacking, right? So if you find, like, you look at example now, South Sudan, we get about $1 billion in aid from the US every year. All of it is humanitarian, is basically buying food to go and feed the people. Not much of it is actually for supporting civil society. You find maybe 2 million, 10 million, 5 million here. And then the 1 billion, most of it is being spent wherever in New York. Some of it is being spent like 40% is being spent by some of these governments. So you find yourself in exile in my case, and the challenge becomes, how do you continue to mobilize to build that citizen power so that you fight for those ideals? And then many of the networks that supported you when you were in jail, for example, in my case, they're like, great, he has been released. It's like the job is finished because I'm out of jail. And as if like I didn't know in advance that I may be detained, I may be in jail, but that's not the point. The point is the objectives for which I'm fighting for, right? So that become a challenge. So ultimately, people like us, we have to come back to the country because that is really where the challenge has to happen, because we cannot allow the space on the ground to be taken entirely by the state. One of the colleagues that I was with in prison, one of my cellmates, was a South Sudanese gentleman called Carbino Wall. Carbino and I used to have a lot of debates about how do we bring democracy to South Sudan. You know very well, South Sudan, we have never had elections since our independence in 2011. The government we have in place is a government that was appointed and has continued to use war, violence, and peace agreements to legitimize itself and to keep itself in power, while at the time bankrupting the entire country and running the economy to the ground. So you have a government now that has a president and 5 vice presidents, all of whom are warlords, and each of whom represent a warring faction. They divide up the cabinet. Each one of them have a certain percentage in the cabinet, which they share among themselves. They divide up the local governments among themselves. So anyone that participates in the government in South Sudan has to be a part of warring faction and has to be allied to a certain warlord. So Carbino was telling me, in this country, the only way you can bring change is through violence. You have to start an armed movement. And I was telling him, no, let us try a nonviolent way, because this country has seen enough violence, level of violence. Let's do it in a nonviolent way. And he said, nonviolent, then why are you in jail? You are here in prison. How are you going to bring about change while you are here? And then he listed some of the guys that have been assassinated inside the country. And he has a point. Now, he later on rebelled after we were released. He actually formed a rebellion. His rebellion was unfortunately not successful, and he was assassinated. But this is the problem that you find ourselves in. Like, what do African people want to be done? We have a continent that is the fastest growing in terms of population. Young people, by the time that this population even stabilized, we would have been the largest by far. We are dealing with climate change. We are very poor. We can't afford to have regimes that are bankrupting countries and keeping them stuck in poverty. This population is going to boom. And when it booms, and without democracy, you're definitely going to have violence. There is no any other way. And given the way that the international political structure is shaping up with the rise of China and the West, and how it's becoming violent with the situation in Ukraine, which is going to provide a model for other things, and where entities like Wagner Group are operating, there is no way you will avoid violence. And I think African leaders and African people have to make a decision. Do we want to go back to the episodes that we saw in 1990s? Because I'm in exile, not because I cannot start a rebellion in South Sudan and join the warlords, but because I don't want to kill South Sudanese, right? And because I don't want to kill South Sudanese, I don't have a seat on the table. And the international community actually endorses this. This is why every time you have these peace deals, you see now with the situation in Sudan, you have Hemeti and Burhan, who have been holding the country hostage. And when they were to be pushed aside so that a civilian government can come to power, they started a war. And now they have subjected everyone to war. And it's because they want to use violence to hold on to power. And there is no way we can allow those people to be the only one to determine the future of the continent. It's our home. It's where we were born. It's where we are going to die. So this is going to be a real challenge for us. How do we move forward? Because this continent has to move forward.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think, like we said when we started this conversation, it's a very difficult conversation, and I'm glad that we are asking those questions. We're trying to deliberate on those questions, and we continue to look for ways that can work. I like what you said. I think the emphasis on non-violent methods, especially for me as a young person in Africa, looking at our history and how much violence stole from us in the past, how much violence is stealing from us today. One of the things that really is a passion for me and for a lot of us young people is just being able to build a culture that does not normalize violence, because the moment we accept the idea of violence being the means to end violence, we just create this domino effect of, you know, a violent Africa, and that's not who we are. That's not the Africa we're trying to build as well. Mimi, I just want to bring you into this conversation because there's a general belief that well-known activists and journalists who are internationally connected and in the spotlight are safer, while ordinary citizens pushing for change suffer in the shadows. How can this space be expanded so that ordinary, perhaps lesser known activists aren't discouraged from doing the work that they're doing? What role do citizen journalists like you have to play here?
Well, let's first start by saying that well-known individuals, but before I begin, I want to first of all also appreciate the inputs of Peter and my other co-panelists. They have elaborated a lot on the situation of activists and people in Africa that are advocating for change and fighting authoritarian regimes, dictators, and so on. I also feel very, very sorry about the situation of activists in eSwatini, which is just exactly what we are facing in Cameroon on a daily basis. It's not up to 3 weeks that we buried a colleague who is also a journalist in the conflict-hit northwest region of Cameroon, who is Anye Ndenso. He was killed by separatists because of the violence that we have in Cameroon. So we are talking about the same thing. From the same continent, we have the same experiences. Journalists go through the same troubles that activists are going through. It's quite unfortunate that that's the way things are on the continent. Well, you asked about how can the space be more equitable so that ordinary, perhaps lesser known activists aren't discouraged from doing their work because they are more targeted than those who are popular. But let me just clarify that well-known activists aren't safe either from authoritarian regimes, because the higher you go, the higher the risk as well. These regimes, the dictators, they are ready to kill even the popular ones, while the lesser known could simply be intimidated, they could be threatened. I'm not saying that they are not also victims, but this is the same things that happen to lesser known people are the same things that happen to people that are actually popular. That was just a clarification. However, I agree that in terms of protections, especially out of our national borders internationally, the well-known activists are likely to get more protection, especially through solidarity. If they find themselves into some kind of trouble, there are international organizations that are there to protect them, to talk about them because they are known. I would want to use my case in particular as an example. When I was unlawfully arrested by the government of Cameroon and sent to prison on the same day, the level of national and international mobilization is one of the reasons why I had to be freed in just a few days. That has not been the case for other journalists who have been arrested and detained. For example, Wazizi, up to now, he was even killed in detention, and up to now, we've not been able to find his body. So officials just came several months after and told us that he died. No explanation, no further information has been given. They said investigations were been launched or were on the way, and we've never had results of those investigations. Now, the one thing that I think can be used to level the ground a little bit is the power of working collectively. And Peter actually elaborated on that. There is need for this strong network, which every journalist and activist can join and be protected, whether they are popular or not. I've always talked about the need for mobilization. I've always talked about the need for journalists to work together. Through this network, it's possible for so many journalists, whether they are popular or not, to be protected in a way. I want to use the case of the Stansted 15 case, which took place here in the UK, where we saw activists that were so daring and they put themselves on the wrong way. They were actually arrested, charged, because they were fighting against very bad immigration laws here in the UK. But because the solidarity behind them was so massive and strong, they were freed. But that's not the situation in Cameroon, where I find myself and where I am actually a citizen. How many activists do we have behind bars? How many journalists are currently in jail? We have Mancho BBC, for instance, who was leading a coffin revolution in 2017. Many of you here might have heard about Mancho BBC was arrested in 2017 after mobilizing the people in the city of Bamenda in the restive northwest region of Cameroon to talk about bad roads, just basic needs, just to decry or denounce some of the ills, the societal ills, just calling for development in the town of Bamenda, calling for justice, calling for peace, calling for people's basic rights like access to potable water, access to electricity, access to good roads. And he was arrested in that same 2017 and jailed. Up to now, he is behind bars. We also have other activists who were denouncing electoral fraud in Cameroon after the 2018 presidential election. Those are actually supporters of the Cameroon Renaissance Movement Party, like Olivier Bibonisak. Many of you might not know him. This might be a case of someone who is lesser known and is currently behind bars because he went out to protest against a dictator that we have in power in Cameroon, who has been there for more than 40 years, and we are still counting. We also have a woman who was also at the helm of the MRC political party, Ms. Pa Awasum, who has been in jail. She was sentenced, and very little or nothing is being said about them. Mancho BBC, T. Conrad, I know that the Committee to Protect Journalists has issued tons of release calling for their immediate freedom, calling for them to be released. I also know that T. Conrad, who is behind bars, Thomas Awa Jr., they are all behind bars. They've been calls for their release, but nothing is actually happening. So what is the consequence? What are some of the consequences of actions like this? It actually destroys the momentum because others are scared to speak up. Because you know that if you speak up, you're going to end up in the shoes of Mancho BBC, for instance. You're going to end up like Thomas Awa Jr. You might even end up in my own shoes. You might become another Mimimefo, you know. So if Mancho BBC leaves jail now, I'm not sure he's going to be as courageous as he was in 2017. He's not going to be the same Mancho BBC we knew before, because as Peter said, the overall objective is to silence activists, to silence the media, to silence journalists, and make sure that those things that you were denouncing, those things that you were criticizing, you'll not continue to do that after they've put you behind bars and released you later. So that's the situation. Like I said, it's all about mobilization, putting in place a network, a powerful network that can bring journalists together to work and mobilize in times like this, especially when one of their colleagues is in trouble, is in some kind of trouble. They can maybe also collaborate with other international organizations to fight for their own colleagues to fight for their freedom if they find themselves behind bars. With the case of Martinez Zogo, for instance, the level of mobilization that we had in Cameroon was different from what we saw with the case of Wazizi. And that's probably why Wazizi was killed. At the end of the day, he died because we didn't have that kind of mobilization that we had with Wazizi. Up to now, his body has not been found, like I said, and no one is saying anything about it. And it seems like there's been no accountability. The government is just getting away with it.
Thank you so much, Mimi, for your contribution. I just wanted to quickly follow up with you on some of the issues and the specific cases you were talking about, and also get your personal reflections on your own work, because of course, you know, and you mentioned Martinez Zogo. We started off the intro of the show discussing him and the fact that we're now 4 months removed from his murder. And you mentioned another name of a journalist who's been killed in the past several months. There's actually been 2 documented killed since that time. You also brought up the case of Samuel Wazizi in 2019, which Reporters Without Borders said was one of the worst crimes against a journalist that they had ever documented. And you also brought up the work of the Committee to Protect Journalists, which does incredible work, including on Cameroon. And according to their data, there are actually 3 journalists currently missing or killed specifically on account of their work, and 5 currently in prison. So given this, you know, incredibly perilous environment, we know that Cameroon is one of the worst places in which to practice journalism, especially for independent journalists. You know, we really wanted to ask you how you personally have been able to maintain this work in the face of constant danger. You've mentioned, you know, going to jail and being in prison simply for reporting the facts. How have you been able to keep this up? And perhaps that could give lessons to other journalists and human rights defenders who are listening today.
I'm sorry for, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, apologies for that. So we have been able to achieve a lot, creating a media structure where journalists can continue to work. We cannot stop because we cannot stop sanitizing the system. We have to continue reporting about what is happening. We've been able to create also a segment because, as you mentioned earlier, we have an online platform called Mimi Mefo Info, where we have at least 15 to 20 journalists working with us. They continue to report what is happening on the ground. But what the situation is here is that these journalists have some sort of layer of security where they cannot be identified as journalists working for Mimi Mefo Info. We have journalists working across Cameroon from the north, south, east, and west. But this veil of anonymity that they have is what is actually protecting them. All of our readers know that it could be me doing some of the reports or most of the stories that we cover on a daily basis. So they come to me to attack, sometimes to slander, to threaten. But I'm quite fortunate that currently I'm out of Cameroon and I'm not directly in the line of fire like my colleagues who are back home would have been if they were identified as journalists working for the Mimi Mefo Info platform. They would troll us on a daily basis on social media, but because we have this layer of security that we've been able to put in place, it's facilitated our work in so many ways. So I get my journalists to continue reporting, which is why we get some of the major stories happening back home firsthand. We have challenges, of course, but before I talk about the challenges that we are facing, we have a platform, we have a segment on our platform that we call the People's Voice that we introduced about 1 or 2 years ago. On People's Voice, people have that ability to air their grievances, to tell us what is happening in their various communities, how our leaders in Cameroon, how institutions, how even politicians are treating them on a daily basis, people who cannot talk. And we air some of these views anonymously. That's how we get to protect some of the people that get to inform us. So that's one of the strategies that as a platform we've put in place. We put off some of these articles unedited. We don't tamper on them so that the government, the institutions, and the personalities in power that are being accused in the stories that we put up respond so that they can also be accountable to the actions. We also have the role to appoint, we bring out these opinions from various individuals so that the society can see, whether the Cameroonians at home or abroad, they can see exactly what is happening in Cameroon. I want to point back to the situation of Wazizi, for example, which is a well-known case today. We didn't know about Wazizi when he was arrested, or before he was even arrested. He disappeared, and then the government just came and said that he died. Mimi Mefo Info didn't stop asking questions from the time he was arrested, even before he was declared dead by the government. We continue to ask those questions. That is the role of our platform. That is the role that we've continued to play as journalists, to ask those compelling questions. And up to today, we've continued to call for justice for Wazizi. That whatever happened to Wazizi, we need to be able to know what happened, exactly what happened, so that his colleagues and even his relatives might be able to have closure. Those are some of the things that we've put in place those are some of the things that we've put in place to be to get the message out there, to let the world know that this is what is happening in Cameroon. The goal is not to stop reporting. The goal is not to stop talking. The goal is to continue talking, but with a level of security for myself and also for the journalists who are back home working for the platform.
Thank you very much, Mimi, and thanks to everyone so far for those valuable contributions and for having the conviction and the strength to speak up and be heard today. For those wondering, we are still waiting for Thulani Maseko. She's had a bit of travel difficulties getting her on time, but we still hope to bring her to you before the end of today's show. Right now, though, we want to turn the stage over to our colleague, Nick Cheeseman, and we'll bring back today's discussant, Arnold Sunga, to get their reactions to the conversation thus far and also to gain their insights into their respective work on the issues and concerns that our speakers have so eloquently raised here today. So, Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, thanks to everyone on the show so far. For those of you who just joined us, a reminder that Arnold is not only an accomplished lawyer and former member of parliament, but also a recipient of the Martinez Award for Human Rights Defenders. So he's a fantastic discussant for this show because he can talk across multiple aspects, both having been a human rights defender himself and a lawyer who understands the legal framework, but also someone who's actually experienced politics and political thrust firsthand. Arnold, it'd be really interesting to hear from you about what you think we've seen in terms of the trend over time. Is this a situation that is getting significantly worse? We heard, for example, in the introduction to today's show that almost 200 people were assassinated across Africa in just 2 years. About 80% of those, we believe, were politically motivated murders. That sounds like an incredible amount, but it's hard to get a handle on whether or not the problem's getting worse or getting better. And one of the things that would also be interesting, I think, for our listeners to hear from you is, you've had a view looking across Southern Africa, but also with the international community of jurists, you've also looked much more broadly than that. Do you see any kind of regional patterns here or things that we can learn from other parts of the world in terms of how to respond? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks for the kind words. But unfortunately, yes, the situation, I think, is getting worse, regrettably, and not just in Africa, but I think globally. I think we see a significant threat to the democratization agenda. I think people are right generally when they say that there's democracy in regression and that authoritarian resurgence or expansion is taking place. You already see in terms of the evidence of expansion of authoritarian practices that elections and electoral processes and practices in Africa, producing more and more conflictual outcomes, I think primarily because some of the leaders approach elections with a mentality of power as an end in itself, and therefore at any cost and by any means. And then therefore the usual thing where you think that electoral processes are about public involvement, civic participation, governmental accountability, and for people to be able to freely express themselves and deploy people into leadership positions in government. And now I think elections are increasingly becoming an instrument of power acquisition and power retention, and there's more chronological compliance with the requirement for elections than substantive compliance with the requirements for free and fair, credible elections in terms of giving people a real opportunity to participate, enjoying fundamental rights and civic space rights that are critical for these processes. And I think with that in mind, you then see some of the symptoms in terms of authoritarian practices entrenching themselves, the attack on civic space, the weaponization of the legal system, the weakening of the rule of law framework and separation of powers, and system of government that places a lot of emphasis on patronage, which creates room for corruption. Like in this part of the world now, Zimbabwe, South Africa, we've seen a lot of money laundering and illicit financial flows that arise as a result of the collusion between people with very strong extractive intent, but also people in government, and especially the highest authorities of the land. And that in itself has really destroyed the level of trust between citizens and those that govern them. And with that breakdown of trust, you see that the only way in which people are then forced to conform to the requirements of governments is through dictatorial and authoritarian practices. And then when you look at that, then people like human rights defenders who are then seen as troublesome, people who may be able to agitate for the building of a critical mass of people who demand for accountable governance, that is then seen as a direct threat. So that's one thing I said when I spoke with Jeff the last time we spoke about the killing of the human rights defenders, that, this is 75 years after, I think, adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and 25 years after the adoption of the Declaration of Human Rights Defenders unanimously at the General Assembly, where there was a sense that persecution, retribution, and reprisals that human rights activists, pro-democracy activists faced needed a collective response. So that is shifted now, where there's beginning more and more in authoritarian states to question whether the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders in fact itself represents a value system that they believe in. Human rights defenders, civil society leaders are beginning to be seen more and more as agents of the West because of the funding models, I think, but also as foreign agents. And as a result, there is a strong narrative to try and delegitimize them. And that delegitimization is deliberate because it's meant to try and create a delinkage between and the organic connection between human rights activists as part of the human rights movement to build social movements, connection with social movements, and grassroots communities to then be able to be agents for social, political, and economic change. So I think that is the reality that we're facing in Africa, that, and it's a global phenomenon, that the democracy as we know it and fundamental rights as enshrined in the Universal Declaration is facing maybe its greatest challenge since the Second World War, and the inability of multilateral institutions to preserve a world order that is underpinned by an international rule of law framework. And in particular now the paralysis of the United Nations Security Council because of the fact that conflict is happening at a level that makes it impossible for the UN Security Council to have any impact. So the dictators, authoritarians in Africa, they are aware of it, that you now have a very weak multilateral environment, and that no one can make them account for these types of atrocities that they are committed. So I think we're going to see the situation getting worse before it can get better, because the institutions of protection, the framework of protection has been weakened, and then some of the institutions have actually been co-opted to become part and parcel of institutions of repression, like in Swaziland or eSwatini, where you can't trust the judiciary, you can't trust the army, you can't trust the security sector, the prosecutorial authority. All those have been acquired to be instruments at the hand of the monarch, who is executing total executive powers minus accountability. And that's really fueling a climate of impunity. And unfortunately, impunity begets more impunity. And once you get more and more impunity, that Peter was right to say that human rights defenders, civil society leaders, pro-democracy activists, legitimate political opponents, these are all unarmed agents for social change who are confronting armed authoritarians who have no hesitation to use the coercive apparatus of the state to kill and then control the justice mechanism to fuel impunity. So with that, it's very easy to feel hopeless, but I think Peter was right as well to say that it's not an option not to continue resistance. We need more resistance on the part of civil society, more civic participation. And for example, my friend Thulani, during his lifetime, I continued saying, my friend, do you think the people of eSwatini are ready to have a conversation around the question of the role of the monarch in governance? And we debated the issue, but he couldn't achieve, in his lifetime, what he has now achieved through the killing that they've done. They've made him manage to communicate the message of democracy, the message of engagement with the authorities around whether we need the monarchy in Swaziland or not. And so what he couldn't achieve in his lifetime, he has actually been able to achieve it as a result of his death. And I think what colleagues have said, Jeff Mantate, about the wonderful role that Tanele is playing to be able to carry through Thulani's legacy of peace, human rights, the rule of law, and dialogue. So we see a real chance in Swaziland that there may be actually a building of a critical mass of people who would then be questioning the king. Let me just try to come to an end, really, and because Peter said something that triggered me around, the role of, African leaders in not holding each other to account. The situation in Swaziland, as well as in Lesotho. Jeffrey spoke about the killing of a journalist that happened this week in Lesotho, and the fact that SADC has really demonstrated inability to hold leaders to account. But the example where sub-regional pressure can work, what happened in the Gambia when Yahya Jammeh lost an election, and the people of the Gambia, it can happen that the conditions are not right for elections, but people can still be able to use voting as a method to remove dictators from power. And it did happen in Liberia, in the Gambia. So the role that Senegal played, and ECOWAS supporting Senegal played in ensuring that the people's verdict, the people's vote will be protected. We need to see more and more that in Africa. In Zimbabwe, unfortunately, in 2008, Mugabe lost an election, but then the president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, then leading SADC, to say, yes, you have lost an election, but you don't lose power. And then now you see it's happening in Swaziland as well, where Thulani gets killed merely for being a peace ambassador, calling for peace. And Swaziland is in the belly, just like Lesotho of South Africa, with a small border going to Mozambique. So if Senegal could push ECOWAS to take measures to defend the people's vote, why don't we see that happening in a country like South Africa as the major economic and political power in Southern Africa? So I really think this trend will increase, but the resistance of people agitating for democracy, yearning for enjoyment of human rights. I don't think that there's any amount of dictatorship that's going to prevent people from continuing to fight for human rights and the struggle for better countries in their communities. Back to you, Anik.
Thanks so much, Arnold. Such wise words there. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, if I may, but I'm going to first of all put some of the things that you were mentioning there and some of the questions that have been coming in by our audience on WhatsApp.
And Nick, actually, just to let you know, we have Tanele with us. She's been able to join us just now.
Oh, great. Well, let's go to that, and then we can wrap up the Q&A questions after.
Tanele, can you hear us? We think you might be on mute.
Yeah, yes, Jeff. Colleagues, good day. I can hear you clearly. Good day.
Thank you so much for joining us. We know you've had a mad dash to get here, and we're so glad to include you in this discussion because we've been talking, for the past hour about the legacy of Thulani and the impact he had on all of us individually and on the struggle for human rights in Swaziland and Africa and worldwide. And we've also been talking about how impressed we are with you as you continue the fight for all that he stood for during his remarkable life. We've really seen an example through you of the power of resilience and continuity. And we've been talking, and Peter raised this in some of his remarks, and people have been asking and wanting to hear from you about what sort of outside support you have found to be most helpful over the past few months, and what advice might you have, what support networks are available for family members who are living through similar situations. We just love to hear your personal reflections, what you've been going through, and some advice for people going through similar situations, because as we've been talking, there have been so many instances like this in the region over the past several years, and just really love your thoughts on that. And thank you again so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me in this space. First and foremost, Thulani was a selfless man, a man who stood for basic human rights, believed in justice. He believed in good governance and the rule of law. Now, coming to your question, what has helped over the couple of months that he's been assassinated is the solidarity. One organization that has come out clearly is Southern Defenders, that they seek justice for Thulani. They seek an accountability for his death, because colleagues in the sub-Saharan regions and colleagues globally believe that Thulani's cause was a just cause. Hence, we are seeking our government to conduct an independent investigation into his killings so that these killings may be accounted for and our governments are held accountable, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanele. And Nick, just to transition back to you, I know we have lots of questions from the audience to Tanele and to others, so please come back in.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks for all of your work tonight. So we've got three kind of questions that I'm going to put to the team. And these, Tanele, just to catch you up, have kind of been questions that have come up in what people have said. They're questions that have come up in what Arnold raised in his role as a discussant, but there are also questions coming in from our viewers around the world. So one of these, I'm going to direct this first to you, Peter, but then others feel free to join in if you would like. How well do you believe human rights defenders prepare and strategize to preempt or prevent the risk of assassinations? What are the most necessary resources they would need to be able to do this better? So Peter, we'll come to you first with that, but then others feel free to pick that up if you want. And to the others, and these are in the chat, by the way, so you can see the wording of them in the chat. To the others, there's been a sort of question that we've come back to a number of times, and Arnold really put his finger on it very well in his comments a moment ago, that there's a risk of a perception that people who speak truth to power in, say, African countries are somehow the mouthpiece of the West and therefore can be legitimated as targets of violence because they're seen to be not doing the work of Africa or somehow doing the work of Western imperialists. And of course, we know that that's not what's happening. They're simply, in most cases, exposing the abuse of power in their own countries and working on things that are usually of great value to their own citizens. But as Arnold pointed out, that perception, which is often driven by a combination of sort of disinformation on the one hand and propaganda on the other, has grown significantly, perhaps in the last 10, 15 years. And it strikes me that one of the problems we also have is that, of course, when people get forced into exile, they end up, joining shows like this, often from Western countries, which perhaps doesn't help us in terms of that perception. So one of the questions we have that came in on WhatsApp is, how do we actually counter that myth? How do we challenge the idea that all of the people who are being critical of governments are somehow agents of the West? And how do we fight back against disinformation and prove that these are genuine African voices? So, Peter, I'll come to you first, if we can, for that question about strategy, and then maybe and Thulani and Arthur will come to you on the question of how can we fight back against the sort of idea that people who are critical because they're somehow voices of the West. How can we reestablish their kind of credentials as actually the true, authentic voices of their own communities? Over to you, Peter.
Well, first of all, let me welcome Tenele. Tenele, it's really good to see you, and I'm glad that you could join us. Let me again express my sincere solidarity with you. I know that you are doing a wonderful work. Thulani stood for great values, and he's lucky to have you. And I have no doubt that you will do everything within your power to spearhead the fulfillment of everything that he sacrificed his life for. This is a challenge that you have as a person, and I think you will always be there to make sure that the sacrifice that Thulani gave was not in vain. And you can count on all of us to do whatever we can within our individual power to help you in that process and to stand in solidarity with people of eSwatini. I have no doubt that the ideals for which Thulani sacrificed his life will be realized, and you will be a big part of it. So whatever you can do, whatever we can do on our own, let us know. We are always happy to join you and to make sure that the struggle for freedom in eSwatini in Swaziland come to a successful conclusion. On the question you asked, Nick, you see, the thing is, we should not worry about what people say. This is a kind of a warfare. We are using nonviolent tactics. They are coming with guns and they are killing us. It's a struggle. And in every rule of warfare, the first thing that happens is that the truth is distorted. You try to paint the enemy in a bad light. So this is happening. We cannot worry about it. That is not even really the point. That is not why we are being targeted. That is not why our message is not driving home. In fact, I believe our message is getting home. That is why we are being targeted. And to say that we are agents of the West is basically an attempt to just delegitimize us. In the context of South Sudan, for example, and many African countries, that doesn't even make any sense. Because when South Sudan was struggled for independence, we were relying on the United States government to help us. Everybody was relying on the West. SPLM leaders, John Garang, Salva Kiir, everyone, we used to come to the United States to support us. And without the United States support, everyone knows South Sudan would have never attained independence. So now for the government to turn around and say, Peter is agent of the West because I'm criticizing corruption and abuse of power, when yesterday I was here in the United States at Harvard University, everywhere in the US, traveling around the country, speaking about the need for the US to support the independence movement in South Sudan. And I was hailed as this great son of South Sudan. So, and it was the same thing that I was doing that I'm doing now. So people of South Sudan see through it. And although they are delegitimizing me, in reality, people know the truth. And I think this is the fundamental issue to the first point that you raised about what do we do as activists and pro-democracy leaders to prepare. The thing is, it's not enough to just speak up. I came from the government into the root of activism. When I left the government, I started speaking up because of the civil war that started in 2013 and all kinds of human rights violations that had happened. And because of the position that I had in the government, I had a lot of details and I had knowledge of what actually happened. So I wanted to counter that. And I realized soon that just speaking up was not enough. And what really needed to be done was to organize citizens. We gotta be able to build citizen power movements. That is the only way. Because if you are alone, then the struggle does not continue. So, and this is precisely what Thulani was able to accomplish in Swaziland. He was able to put together, through the multi-stakeholder stakeholder forum, a group of people from all kinds of backgrounds to build a citizen power. And even in those cases, if they kill you, because look, when we take this struggle, we know that that is a potential outcome, So when that happens, there is a movement that will continue the struggle that you have started. And you have people like Tanela now, people like Maxwell, Dlamini, and others within eSwatini that are going to carry that forward. So we got to be able to do that better. We got to really be able to build citizen power movement. You can't just be talking as a journalist, writing your article here and there. This is a political struggle. And the only way it would end is not that you will change the mind of the regime to respect the human rights of its citizen. These regimes operate with a particular kind of logic. They are an extreme form of neo-patrimonial regime that relies on violence and use disorder as a way of projecting political power. So this is the strategy, it's part of the handbook. So what you gotta do is you have to be able to build citizen power, you have to be able to be organized, and you have to go for political power. This only ends because you put in positions of power individuals that understand the value of democracy, the value of free speech, the value of creating an open society in which citizens can debate ideas without using deadly force. So we gotta treat it like that. It's a struggle for political power. And you cannot get political power without organizing citizens. Second thing that we have to put in our mind is that we are dealing with individuals that do not fear to use violence and are willing to kill us. And we are not there as lambs to be sacrificed or like sons of gods that are sent to be killed. We are individual, we bleed, our families, they love us, they miss us. So we gotta be able to anticipate really the level of threat that we face and be mindful of our security. Obviously, there are things that are beyond that we cannot control. But there are some things, depending on the circumstances in your particular country, in which you could better prepare yourself in terms of creating security networks around you. And I think also international organizations, they always run away when you mention something like security. And I can tell you, without my background in the security institutions, I probably would not be alive here today. But that provides me certain skill sets and certain networks that have continued to help in particular way. And I want to advise human rights activists to also create their own relations with security institutions, not the ones that are determined by the networks of power. In case of South Sudan, for example, now, although the elements that tried to assassinate me in Kenya came from the National Security Service, I know for a fact there are so many individuals within the institution that detest those kind of ideas and who are willing to help in whatever way they could, including by warning me that such a thing was happening. So we have to be able to establish those relations and where possible to be able to protect ourselves to the best of our abilities when we can. Not that I'm condoning any use of violence and people go out there and use violence, but the thing is, we are not there to be killed. And there is nothing the world is going to gain when we are slaughtered like dogs, So we gotta be able to prevent that. And everyone that try to threaten us, that think that they're going to slaughter us like dogs, they have to understand. Like one time, I was called into the office of the National Security in South Sudan. And I was told by the director, one of the generals, that they're going to shoot me in the street like Juba, like a dog. Now, what I told the gentleman is that he was not made of iron. He's also made of flesh and blood like myself, and he can be shot, just like he was telling me that he can be shot. So what we have to put in mind is that anyone that is threatening people there, they are not also made of like iron. They are also made of flesh and bodies, and they can also be shot the same way that we can also be shot. And if we create that kind of society we are going to end up in a Hobbesian state of anarchy, of every man against every man, and which no one will be safe. Because if you take a country like South Sudan, we have more than 14 million small arms. Every male above the age of 13 knows how to operate AK-47. So if we try to make this issue of political assassination to become a culture, then potentially anyone in the country can be assassinated. So people have to understand that. So we have to be able to move away from that. We have to be able to disagree. It's our country. Africa is our continent. We want to make sure it moves forward. There is a vigorous debate. All people, young people, women, everybody have a role to play. But when people try to use violence, that distorts it. And it drives us all to be violent actors. And we don't want to do that. We want to be able to debate the future of our continent in a civilized way without necessarily killing each other. But those who continue to stick to violence, they must understand that. Finally, we really have to do a better job of coordinating with one another and supporting one another across the continents. We cannot rely on the sub-regional groups. SADC, IGAD, all these groups, they're practically useless, just like African Union and just like the United Nations to a certain extent. The whole international architecture doesn't work. And this is really I don't know, if I were to work at the State Department, I would be so stressed because nothing works. Like US is paying $1 billion in South Sudan to subsidize this UN mission, deploy under Chapter 7 to protect people using all means. And then people are shot on the gates of the UN, and the UN doesn't lift a finger, yet it's costing American taxpayers hundreds and hundreds of millions. So nothing works. So people who are just subsidizing all this of failure better wake up and realize that the world has changed. And not only when there has been a coup in West Africa and people are kicking out France, like everything that Mimi was talking about in Cameroon, France has been subsidizing that for like 40 years, and they're gonna sit here and talk about like, Russia is bad here and all of that is bad here. No, all of these entities, they are just, playing lip service. So we gotta be able to also call them on that and be able to speak the truth to them. We cannot just take them as allies and they are allies, so we have to just sugarcoat everything that is going on. No, terrible things are being done by the Western countries. Opportunities are being missed. They are disempowering us. In fact, they are making it difficult for us to fight and free our people. And if they really believe that the freedom is the virtue as they claim it is, they better support us in a real sense, not just through a lip service.
Thanks, Peter. I'm sure people at home heard that very, very powerfully. In line with that, we've just received a remarkable message, and it's so remarkable that I think I should read it out. It's from people who ask us not to mention their name or their institution because they say that their lives are currently under threat. They say that they work in the Democratic Republic of Congo to protect the rights of indigenous people there who are being forced off their traditional lands to make way for conservation and illicit mineral extraction. They say that because they are gaining global attention and because they're exposing crimes, the powers that be are threatening and even attempting to kill some of them who refuse to be silent. A number of their group are already in hiding in fear of their lives. They say, as Peter said, they are attempting to block our ability to mobilize people on the ground. What's very disappointing, and this is the bit that I want to put to Mimi and Tinele in a moment, what's very disappointing, they say, is that donors are diverting funds away from some of us, from some people who speak out, and towards those who are more silent or deny that the crimes are taking place. Thus, we feel that we are not only threatened with death, we are also unable to financially support our families. Is there any way we could collectively make a plea to donors to stop backing the perpetrators and their apologists and instead support frontline activists who could mobilize local communities to demand change? So Mimi and Tinele are sort of tweaking the question that I initially was going to put to you, which was about the risk of being branded as mouthpieces for Western governments. We actually have from Peter and from some of our viewers a rather different point, which is that the international community is sometimes refusing to step up and protect activists. And beyond that, sometimes perhaps for economic reasons, actually seeks to demobilize them and is complicit in their silencing. It would be wonderful to have your insights on that before we wrap up the show. Thank you. Maybe we'll go to Mimi first and then Tinele to bring it home.
Well, talking about solutions, I would always want to, first of all, one of the most important things here is understanding who your adversary is, who you're actually fighting against. And the question that I want to ask is, can a critical, independent human rights defender continue to work in a country like Cameroon, DR Congo, where this question is coming from, or elsewhere in Africa, with this delicate situation that is being presented? Well, it's actually very, very perilous, because whether government or non-government actors, in Cameroon, we've got conflict that is has been going on in the 2 English-speaking regions for about more than 7 years now, and we are still counting. It's now an armed conflict, and it's because of the conflict, thousands of people are dead and over 1 million displaced. And up to now, we don't know the exact number of people so far that have died, because human rights defenders cannot go to these regions to conduct data and talk to the people. Actually, both sides are now using human rights defenders, including journalists, activists, as propaganda tools, which is not really consistent with the job of rights defenders, with the job of journalists. So, whereas journalists should be able to hold power to account, journalists should be able to ask questions, journalists should be able to say, okay, this is happening here, should be able to carry out research and come up with solutions. But that is not the case in a country like Cameroon, where we have the government fighting against rights defenders. We also have non-state actors. We also have the opposition sometimes fighting against those who speak out, particularly the media, because I'm part of the media. It's also a culture in Cameroon. Another culture in Cameroon is there's absolutely no accountability. It starts from the head to the bottom. When human rights defenders talk about overcrowding in prisons, for instance, he is now attacking the Ministry of Justice. If a journalist reports about series of accidents, this is happening here on a daily basis, possibly to sensitize the population, also let the government know that this is what is happening in the country. It appears as though the journalist is now attacking the Ministry of Transport. If you talk about the situation of citizens, criticize the government, you are attacking the Ministry of Territorial Administration. So instead of them trying to solve some of these problems, they spend the time trying to attack human rights defenders that are fighting for some of these people. Doctors Without Borders in Cameroon, for instance, they cannot operate anymore in these conflicted regions. Amnesty International is another example, was declared persona non grata in Cameroon by the former Minister of Communication. We also have Human Rights Watch. They've never been allowed access to Cameroon. These are some of the situations that we are facing. How can human rights defenders continue to fight for those people who are there on the ground when access is almost impossible? For me, I think there could be solutions. Earlier, Jeff was talking about journalists that have been killed in Cameroon in the past months. We talked about Wazizi, but I should say that since the start of 2023, 3 journalists have been killed in Cameroon, and plus Wazizi, we have 4 in the past months or in the past years. In January, we had Martinez Zogo, and just few days after, we had Ola Bebe, who was also killed in Yaoundé in the central region of Cameroon, and then Anye, who was killed recently by separatists. So when you look at the portfolio of all of these journalists that were killed, you see that some were popular, others were not popular at all. they only became popular after what happened to them happened. And Samuel Wazizi, for instance, wasn't really as popular. Like I said, Martinez Zogo was one of the most popular journalists in Cameroon, was in the middle of an investigation when he was killed, but then he was killed. So those who are defending the rights of citizens would question if Martinez Zogo could be killed and paraded naked in broad daylight by his killers. What about me? What about me, a commoner? What about me, a lesser known citizen? So I think there could be solutions, which is what I said earlier, that Mimefo Info is a platform that we've been able to mask the identities, because a dead human rights defender is not what we want. We don't want a human rights defender who is dead. And like one of my colleagues said, just after Anye was killed in Cameroon, we cannot count the number of stories now that will go untold because he has been killed. We want to be there to tell the story, to continue to talk about the people. So what can we do to protect ourselves when we know that it might take a long time to probably mobilize, to probably create these networks that we want to exist? Masking identities could be an option. Like I said, I have a battery of journalists working across Cameroon, but they don't use their identities for the time being because we have a dictator in power. If they work openly as Mimefo Info reporters, that could put them in danger. Also, stepping out and fighting in exile, I'm an example. It's also very important. It could also be a solution. While waiting for things maybe to settle down, to see how it goes, could also be a solution. And possibly using pseudonyms, VPN. No matter what you do, you shouldn't be bitter. You should continue, because the overall objective is to stop you from doing what you're doing. You have to continue doing and put in place all the security measures that you have to put in place so that you wouldn't stop doing your job. So I think that we can continue to tell the story of the people. Human rights defenders can continue to do the job, but they can also doing that, making sure that they are absolutely protected, that they can also doing that by working together in synergy with other networking organizations. I know of a few in Africa, but I cannot really tell for sure how powerful these organizations are when it comes to defending their colleagues who are in trouble. There's need to reinforce. There's need to remobilize and re-strategize and see what could be done to protect rights defenders more than what I see on the continent.
Thanks so much. And today we'll come to you. Quite right that you get to have the last word. And I think it would be great for people at home both to hear your reflections on what we've just been discussing, but also perhaps, you're becoming an inspirational figure for people because you built something positive out of a tragedy. And perhaps, one of the things that you might also address a little bit in your comments is how you've been able to do that and how you've had, that resilience and that strength, and perhaps how, that can teach us lessons that, these defeats and these setbacks can be, as I think Peter put it, milestones in the longer struggle. And I think it would be really powerful for people at home perhaps to hear a little bit about how you've done that, both practically, but also kind of emotionally over the last year. So over to you for the final word.
Thank you so much, Peter. First and foremost, I'd like to start by saying Swaziland is a ticking time bomb. And for a very long time, the leaders in our region are ignoring that. But what is clear to me now, Peter has also said we need to build our citizens, we need to build the power. We need to encourage our people to say, yes, they've killed Thulani, but we need to increase our voice. We need to mobilize ourselves and create a proper messaging to our citizens to say, yes, Daniele may be killed, yes, Thulani is killed, but as citizens, we need to stand up for what is right. That is one. So we need to continue to increase our voice, to encourage citizens in our country, back in the communities, to know what is right, to stand for their human rights. Secondly, I'd also want to encourage people to say, yes, there is continued surveillance with us human rights defenders. Yes, there is interference in terms of bugging of our phones and everything, but we need to rise above the intimidation. I mean, Thulani's killing was a clear indication to citizens in Swaziland that if you speak out, I will kill. But we need to rise above that. We need to be clear to say, Your Majesty, we hold you accountable. Your government is corrupt. Our health system is collapsing. We need to be able to rise above everything else and get that willpower from within ourselves to be honest to our governments, to say, we will hold you accountable every step of the way. And colleagues, I would plead with to continue raising this, continue assisting us in terms of advocacy, in terms of security upgrades, because it is clear to me that Africa is a ticking time bomb, but it is us, the citizens of Africa, that need to inform people around the globe that this is what is happening and to rise above every form of intimidation. So I'd really encourage international organization to help us in organizing ourselves in terms of security, but in terms of re-mobilizing ourselves and our messaging that Africa is a ticking time bomb. Swaziland, we live under an absolute monarch. So all those issues, colleagues, I think we need to highlight more. And of course, solidarity, as I end, is also important, because what has kept me going is the solidarity that I receive from different organizations, Southern Defenders, Amnesty International. The solidarity is important because it helps you to then know that, yes, they may want to kill me, yes, they're hunting me down, but there's someone out there who's willing to assist and who's willing to come and help. So really, solidarity does go a long way, but I do concur with Peter that we need to also go back at grassroots level in our communities, educate our communities on human rights, on the basics and on everything that is happening, so that people are aware of these issues and they're able to rise up and speak for themselves. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a great message for many of the people, hopefully at home, that, you know, there are things that we can do, even if we're not frontline in the struggle, supporting organizations like Southern Defenders, Frontline Defenders, Amnesty, and amplifying the voices of people who are being attacked, so that people understand that actually, if you try and assassinate people, other people will spread their message more effectively on social media. And actually, those attacks then start to create more embarrassment for governments and more problems for governments. So just, I think, a really powerful message for everyone at home, that we don't have to be passive watchers of this process. We also can play a role in building that support web. And of course, that's one of the things that Resistance Bureau itself was set up to try and do. Thanks so much for your inspiring words, panel. It's been really great. Arnold, I would come back to you, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I'm going to send it back to Jeff and Mantade to take us home.
Thank you so much, Nick. This entire discussion has been heavy, but with all the sadness associated with the stories that we've had, we also feel very energized by this constant reminder of what is being done and what can be done, because it gives us hope. And hope is what sustains the struggle for democratic freedom in Africa. We have come to the end of today's show, a tribute to those who have lost their lives advocating for an Africa that's more just. We hope that you have been inspired and will continue to do the great work that you're doing. A special shout out to our speakers today for a job well done. Our team at the Resistance Bureau looks forward to keeping in touch with all of you and to highlighting the important work that you do moving forward. You truly inspire and give us hope. And thanks again for taking the time to be a part of this show today. And of course, thank you to our audience as well for engaging with us and for tuning in. Please stay in touch between shows by visiting our website, www.theresistancebureau.com, and by subscribing on our homepage to get updates on the show, as well as show summaries and participant videos. On our website, you can also revisit past shows, all of which are saved in the episode section. We're also on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, as well as on YouTube. We are all covered in different bases. As a final note, the continued impact of this program is a real testament to the efforts of our entire team. As always, thank you so much to our tech manager, Peter Dory, our creative director, Ndono Msara, who work behind the scenes to make the Resistance Bureau a continued success. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We truly appreciate it. Stay safe in the meantime, keep fighting the good fight, and see you next time. Goodbye.